everyone. I would like to say that I've decided to end my break a bit early today. I've been actually feeling much better now. I've gotten my mind cleared of a lot of negativity, but it's great that I'm back to my usual self. So yeah, I know this is an early return, but anyways, I think these past few weeks I've had a lot of time rather to just to lament on a few things and take a few things into consideration. And now that I'm feeling much better, I think it's time that I treated my followers to a nice video again. It's really it's really wrong for me to deny Iranians of this great rich content which many of them may not have otherwise have access to without me or my efforts. So my state of devotion to Iran shall remain for a very long time, and I am very grateful to all of my great supporters and followers who have stood by my side for a very long time and through everything that I have been through, and I really appreciate it. I really appreciate all the support, and I really appreciate all the kind comments as well as the bad comments. I don't really mind criticism, so yeah, that's essentially it. But yeah, thanks everyone, I appreciate it, and I will now get on with my video. In this video I will discuss the rise of the Turks and the arrival of the Turks into Iran and the establishment of the Turkic Dynasties. So the Turks had been arriving in the Islamic world since the 9th and 10th centuries, primarily from Central Asia, after the Battle of Talas in 751, which resulted in an Abbasid victory. The Abbasids expanded into the Fergana Valley, where many of these Turkic groups had migrated from the northern steppes of Mongolia and established themselves. And the Battle of Talas really allowed the Abbasids to expand into previously Turkic territory, which had been originally Iranic, but the Turks recently had penetrated this territory and were establishing themselves just around this time. And although there was interaction between the Iranic world as well as Turks before the rise of Islam, the Turks did not really penetrate the Iranian heartland until after the Arab conquest of Iran and the establishment of the Arab caliphates. Now, by the time of the 9th century, the Arabs had begun importing Turks en masse from Central Asia. And later on, they would also import many Turks from the steppes of Europe, where the Turks also had migrated, known as the Dasht-e-Kipchak, named after the Kipchak Turks, also known as the Cumans. Now, essentially, what happened here was when the Turks arrived in the Islamic world, they were essentially foreigners. They would be akin to the Vikings arriving into a largely Christian Europe, or even the Normans arriving into a largely Christian southern European world. And essentially the Turks can be seen very similarly to the Normans in Europe. And what happened during this time was the Turks were brought in as slaves. Eventually they managed to infiltrate the Abbasid Caliphate's government and establish themselves. The first independent Turkic dynasty was in Egypt, the Tulunids, established by Ahmed ibn Tulun. Now, the rise of these Turkic dynasties was quite interesting because, the Turks had actually not really gained much power in the Middle East until the 9th century. And once they began establishing themselves, it actually allowed for the migration of more Turkic tribes into the Middle East and the establishment of more larger and more powerful Turkic states. So the very first of these major Turkic states to be established in what is today Iran is the Ghaznavid dynasty. Now, the Ghaznavid dynasty was founded by Alptigin, who revolted against the Samanid Empire in Greater Khorasan and eventually overwhelmed the Samarids as well as the Saffarids and established himself in the former domains of these dynasties, ending the Iranian intermezzo period. And Mahmud also expanded into most of what is today Afghanistan as well as into Pakistan, going as far as Lahore. And in fact, he also carried out raids in Gujarat and sacked many famous Hindu temples, most notably the temple at Somnath. And these initial victories allowed for the Ghaznavids to establish themselves, and their rise again brought an end to the Iranian intermezzo period. They essentially replaced the previous ruling elites and the Iranian elites, and their rise heralded in a period of Turkic domination in Iran. And the Ghaznavids, actually it was under their rule, under the rule of Mahmud Ghaznavi, who was their most notable ruler, that Ferdowsi wrote his famous epic, the Shahnameh. So essentially, these Turks were largely patrons of Persian culture. In their court, their official language was the Persian language, as well as their lingua franca. Arabic was only used for theological purposes, and the Turkic language was only restricted to the military. Nonetheless, these Turks essentially allowed, despite removing the Iranian dynasties from power, they allowed for the preservation of Persian culture in Iran, and the Ghaznavids also began spreading Persianate culture into South Asia, and they were actually the first major Persianate dynasty to control parts of South Asia since the fall of the old Persian empires. The Sassanids, as well as the Parthians and Achaemenids, had a lot of influence in what is today the Indus Valley region in South Asia. But nonetheless, the Ghaznavids were the first major Persianate dynasty since that period to establish some sort of influence and power in contemporary South Asia, and their influence and power essentially allowed for the spread of Persianate culture, not only not only the preservation of this culture in Iran, but also it spread to much of South Asia, much of northwestern South Asia rather. Following the Ghaznavids, you had another dynasty, and they were the Seljuk dynasty, and the Seljuks would form an even greater empire than the Ghaznavids, originating in the Central Asian steppes. They eventually expanded southwards and came to dominate much of Iran, the Omani coast, as well as the Levant and Anatolia. But the first major battle which allowed them to expand into Iran was the Battle of Dandanakan, and this battle essentially allowed for the Seljuks to establish their empire. It was when the Seljuk rulers defeated Masud I of the Ghaznavids, and he lost most of his western territories. This allowed Tughril to even invade much of the Buyid domains. The Buyids were also Persians from their origins were largely from northwestern Iran, and they were established for quite some time. But once the Seljuks arrived, they displaced the Buyids and established themselves in their place. The Buyids were essentially Dalamite warriors who had been established in the region of Dalam, and prior to their rise in Dalam, they came to, they were pretty much raiders, and, they were just marauders. But nonetheless, once they became established in parts of Western Iran, they promoted Persian culture, and, the shift back to Persian culture in Iran really began with the Buyids and the Samanids, but the Turks, who moved in later, just preserved that culture. Essentially, after the rise of the Seljuks, their expansion into much of the Iranian heartland, and this essentially allowed them to pretty much dominate much of the region and spread the Persian language and culture again. Just preserve it and ensure that much of these previous territories on the western fringes of what is today Iran had been somewhat Arabized, but the Seljuks, the rise of the Seljuks ensured that Persian would remain the dominant language in these regions, and the most notable rulers of the Seljuk dynasty are obviously Alp Arslan, who won the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 against the Byzantines and allowed for the Turkic expansion into Anatolia, as well as Malik Shah, who reigned at the height of the Seljuk Empire when it was at its greatest extent. And actually, After this, the Seljuks began fragmenting, but during their peak, their most notable vizier was Nizam al-Mulk, who was a Persian, and essentially during this time, much of the administration was still handled by Persians. The Turks were only the military elite, and they did not have any say really outside of military affairs. Much of the native governance was actually dominated by locals, especially Persians, and the most notable of this was Nizam al-Mulk. Now, after the death of Malik Shah, the dynasty essentially collapsed, and it fragmented into tiny states. There were various tiny emirates. There were in Damascus, in Aleppo, in Mosul, in much of Iran. And it was actually during this period of fragmentation rather, that the Crusades happened, and the Seljuks were unfortunately unable to adequately resist the First Crusade. Nonetheless, they managed to decisively win engagements against the Crusaders during the Second Crusade, as well as in between the First and Second Crusades, and proved to be a major factor in ensuring that the Crusaders would not have any long-term success in the region. And actually, the Seljuks were pretty much dominant in Anatolia until the rise of the Mongols and the Mongol invasions. But I won't get into that. I will now discuss the last and final major Turkic dynasty which ruled Iran before the Mongol conquests, and this dynasty was the Khwarezmian Empire. Now, the Khwarezmians were another Persianized Turkic dynasty. Their ancestors had actually migrated into the largely Iranic region of Khwarezm, and this was during the 10th century, I believe. But anyways, the Khwarezmians rose up, eventually migrating into this region, and they rose up. They overthrew the previous Seljuks and established themselves. Not really, although they were initially established in 1077, they did not rise to complete dominance of Iran and Iranian Central Asia until the reign of Shah Muhammad II, who had really completely and essentially reunited Iran. And this was the peak. He ruled over an empire at the peak of the Persianate world and culture, and his empire spanned all the way from Azerbaijan to contemporary Central Asia, which at the time was largely Iranic. This was a period before the Mongols invaded and subjugated much of Iranian Central Asia and Iran, and replaced the native much of the native population in they massacred much of the native population in Central Asia, and replaced the native bureaucracy with a largely Mongol dominated bureaucracy. But nonetheless, the Khwarezmian Empire truly represented the peak of Iranian civilization, and the Khwarezmians ruled over an empire which was at its peak. And this empire really and truly it truly represented the height of Iranic culture and civilization. And unfortunately, the Mongols invaded them and destroyed this civilization. But nonetheless, the Khwarezmians, had the Khwarezmian Empire survived until today, much of Iran would have likely and largely been unified today, and Iran would have been able to be a dominant regional power, united from Central Asia to all the way to much of contemporary Western Iran, as well as Azerbaijan. And I think that had the Khwarezmians managed to stave off the Mongol invasion, it really would have been interesting to see how history would have unfolded. But anyways, that's essentially it for this video. I've got nothing else to say, and yeah, that's pretty much it. I would really appreciate it if you could like this video, subscribe, and share it wherever you can. And thank you for your support again, and take care.